Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 810, June the 15th, 1987. David Emery, who has a broadcast on KFJC and KKUP and puts World Watchers on those stations, brought me this past weekend a couple of pages that some listener was sharing with him from the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections from Ohio. It was put out by James Rhodes, the governor of Ohio, signed November the 14th, 1975. And what was listed on 2 pages were publications not to be permitted in the institutions that the guards were to screen out. And of the 59 publications listed on the 2 pages, there are very few political items. One is the LA Free Press, and one is Free Martin Sostre. He was in prison in New Jersey, a political activist, and the Philadelphia Digest. The rest were magazines for homosexuals, and they were keeping them from inside the prison, such as Barbarians, Black Room for Swingers, Best of the San Francisco Ball, Black Dragon, Fighting Society, and so forth. But number 29 on this list of books that or publications that could be not be sent into the prison was listed King Alfred National Security Council, which is a total misfit in this list of publications because there's no publication put out by the National Security Council. And on the anniversary of the birth of Martin Luther King this year, I read on the air, as I do from time to time, the document that was obtained from the National Security Council or someone in it on the plans to vaporize and kill all blacks in America. Now, I look back at the year 1975. I was very active in prison work at that time from 1970 through 75, about that time period. And I went to Ohio to speak. John Judge had arranged for me to speak at the university there at Dayton. And then he went with me out in the country, way out outside of Dayton. There's a large prison. And I visited a prisoner there who I'd been corresponding with and was interested in my research and things I had written. And so I went to see him and then went back to Dayton and then flew up to Minneapolis to visit with a friend. And the friend I visited, just coincidentally, happened to be the one who had the King Alfred plan, the one that I got it from. It was among his belongings. And he is the person it was given to. So that, in a world of coincidences, I just want to bring it up because I was in the prison around between April and May of 75 in that time period. And then November 75, they're stated on number 29, publications not to be permitted. Of course, we know King Alfred National Security Council isn't a publication, but I just wonder why that was inserted. It was inserted there for a reason, and I'll try and write to the Department of Rehabilitation in Ohio and see if they have any recall or memos on why it was there. Last week I just mentioned briefly how Tom Hayden was supposed to speak at a very small college out here in San Jose City College, and he was to partake of the graduation ceremony. It was canceled because of the Vietnamese community. There were 1,100 students in the college, and out of 13,000 students, 1,100 are Vietnamese. Luckily, he showed up. I think he did the right thing because when you bow down to the wishes of those people who were offended because he took a position during the Vietnam War that was opposed to those people's activities during the Vietnam War, it doesn't mean that either one was right or wrong. The police establishment, the military establishment, the ruling people, DM through the leaders of the Vietnamese government, were oppressive. They were exploitive. They were brought over lots of gold and narcotics traffic has been linked to them. And I'm not saying these people are involved in that, but a lot of people were brought over from South Vietnam who are collecting a lot of money, intelligence, and so forth to go back and invade that country someday. They're open about that. But I think that Tom Hayden made the right decision. It would be a dark day for our democracy to bow down to people who say that you can't be there because I didn't like what you did in our country, considering why they're here is because of what they did to their own country. So he did show up. There's an article in the San Jose Mercury that there should be a apology by or an explanation by the heads of the college, an editorial, the war over Hayden, and then this week, just a couple of days ago, the San Jose Mercury had a story that an apology ended the rift. The Vietnamese Americans called off a boycott. They were going to take their students out of that college, and millions of dollars, a large amount of millions of dollars per student. It was listed, get money to go to that place. And the Department of the Education in California is paying very nicely to see that they get a good education, and they've called off their boycott of not going to that college and offering a bait, I guess, to another college where you can also influence who speaks at graduation. I would hope not. I hope this ends it once and for all. Several months ago, I talked about a set of teachers in California, in San Bernardino County, who were arrested because they hired Franklin Camper and his outfit to do a firebombing in 2 garages where 2 of their teachers were that they didn't like. They didn't like the teachers. They had fired them. And one lady was the head of a chain of private nursery schools. And thinking in terms of little itty-bitty children at nursery school, and she brings probably one of the top terrorist trainers in the whole United States, the same ilk as G. Gordon Liddy, and the special forces that Mr. Corkle and Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson were associated with, these terrorist activity centers that send weapons and ammunition and train in the United States. Well, Franklin Camper was arrested. He did come to California. I didn't believe that he would be really given a harsh sentence. The teacher was given 2 years, but according to the LA Times, Camper was sentenced to 14 years in prison for his role in the firebombing. Now, Camper links to Robert Vesco and the Crystal River group that were planning the invasion of Dominica. He also links to the Sikhs who were trained at his camp for blowing up the Air India and the explosion on the Japanese plane that was going to India that blew up at the airport. Only a few people were killed, not the whole plane going down. So they have Camper locked up. He worked for the FBI and the CIA, and I really can't believe, very quietly, on one of the back pages of the LA Times, he did get 14 years. He may be out in 6 years on good behavior, but that is really locking up one of the biggies. The Liberty Lobby magazine newspaper had a large picture, 1/4 of a page, meet famous attorney Mark Lane to speak at the confab. Liberty Lobby, of course, is run by Willie Carto, one of the near close to avowed Nazis in the United States, and he has a foundation in California that says the Holocaust didn't exist. Most of you know the politics of Liberty Lobby, and you know that Mark Lane has been their attorney for a long time. But they had a celebration in Washington. They said, come and have the opportunity to meet the famed civil libertarian Mark Lane at the Stouffer Concourse Hotel in Arlington, Virginia. They're having a powwow of people getting together. Oh, they're advertising ahead. It's going to be in September if you want to meet the famous Lane, and they're proud of him. He's their attorney, the man who published wrote Rush to Judgment. Very interesting, because starting in 1967, as I've said before, I used to send out in my mail slips of paper telling the Nazi connections to the Kennedy assassination that were suppressed by Mark Lane, and he now not only represents Willie Carto and Liberty Lobby, but they're having a big party, and he's the guest speaker, and they're proud of their lawyer, and I'm sure they both love each other. There's an article in the paper this morning that shows a new turning point in the way media and events are covering material now that should have been stated more clearly before, but every day there's a new stepping stone towards awareness of things happening. This came out of Panama City, and Mr. Noriega says the unrest is caused by foreigners there, the riots, and he said they don't want Panama to gain control of the Panama Canal. The traditional enemies of Panama think it's a colony of theirs. They're manipulating and supporting the destabilization of Panama. There have been riots there since last week. Diaz Herrera, 49, accused Mr. Noriega, on the other hand, of involvement in the 1981 plane crash of General Omar Torrijos, who seized power in a 68 coup. On Friday, Diaz Herrera called Torrijos' death a CIA plot involving a bomb aboard the plane, and claimed the Reagan administration was also involved in that particular death. Now, Reagan administration means George Bush, a CIA director who worked with the people who killed Orlando Letelier, who blew up Air Cuba, And Bush has been called by me for years Killer Bush because of his relationship to a lot of murders. But now they're out in the open, at least in the open, saying that the Trujillo's death was caused by the CIA, a bomb was planted, and people in the Reagan administration had a role in it. Diaz Herrera, the recently retired Defense Forces Chief of Staff, had said that Noriega, with the knowledge of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, was involved in drug sales. Noriega previously blamed the allegations that he was behind trafficking, arms dealing, and election fraud on elements of the United States opposed to the 1977 Canal Treaty. Well, they're having a fight in Panama, and Jesse Helms is a part of that, and there are a lot of elements fighting in Panama, but as the fighting goes out, we see in the media the accusations of the Reagan administration being involved with the people who killed the president of Panama at one time, General Omar Torrijos, and the CIA involving drug traffic and gun running, and all of that is happening in Panama, but they're fingering people in the Reagan administration, and the team working for Reagan have been a team going way back from the invasion of Guatemala and the Bay of Pigs and the overthrow of Mossadegh and so forth. Before I get on to Iran-Contra affairs, I do have some things I want to update. The San Francisco Chronicle last week, on January 8th, had a long article, Can We Govern Evolution? It's a two-page article, the half of the entire newspaper, one page. And it tells about advanced genetic sciences trying to put their altered bacteria on strawberries. And the lady who's spraying there, all covered up, you've seen her famous picture everywhere, announced this week that the spraying was a great success. Julianne Lindemann, not covered up in blue jeans, is pointing to the ground and saying this is a great success. But the important thing about this article that was published on AGS, this is the quotation, spraying antifreeze solution on strawberries, as happened in a field out near Mount Diablo the other day, hardly seems like an earth-shaking matter. But it may be the first step in a historic venture that's taking the human race into uncharted territory, a move more momentous than Neil Armstrong's first step on the moon. Now, maybe they're exaggerating, maybe I didn't give it enough importance, but I gave it a lot of importance, and all of a sudden, as they begin spraying, this is a momentous event, even more so than going to the moon. So goodness knows what is on the spray. The same article says, it's a long article, I just want to give you one of the quotations. The East Bay Company, Advanced Genetic Sciences, which sells the SnowMax bacteria to ski operators, it's known as SnowMax, and it holds the ice so that it's good for skiing, holds it together, is a small company out of the East Bay in Oakland. Now, that's the way they pass it off, as a small company in the East Bay in Oakland. But I refer you again to New York Times, March the 6th, 1986, and there's a picture of Joseph Buchert, the chief executive of AGS, Bouchkaert, and the article from the New York Times explains that Mr. Buchert commutes between Belgium and Oakland, that he's from Belgium, and he is the head of the genetic systems there in Belgium, a Belgian company of which AGS owns a third. And he runs both companies in Belgium and in Oakland, flies back and forth every 2 weeks. And then the company has investments. Again, AGS raised $24 million, much of it from Roman Haas and Hillsberg AB, a Swedish company, each of which owned 16% and went public on the stock market in '83. Mr. Buchert plans to settle in California, and he's hired a public relations firm, Book and Company, to build up the image of AGS. Last year, AGS got a desperately needed cash infusion, $4 million from a Swedish company, Karamis Shams Ollie Fabriker AB. It's trying to win research contracts from large companies. It already has agreements with Roman Haas, DuPont, Stanford Oil. So these are not small companies, and again, it was passed off as a little Oakland company that wanted to keep strawberries from freezing, and then after they sprayed it for one day, the San Francisco Chronicle had an article last Tuesday, East Bay microbe test called a success. Now, for all the controversy, how could you tell in 2 to 3 weeks whether or not what they wanted was a success? and they keep playing as a little company, and then all of a sudden it's more important than when we land at the moon. So there's more to AGS and what they sprayed or what they intend to do if it's more important than landing to the moon. Not that one person has the final word, but those flowing adjectives about the experiment and what it was doing suggested that it could be a big breakthrough, but we haven't seen the advantages of landing to the moon yet, and there may be disadvantages to putting genetically altered bacteria on your food. Now, this Wednesday night, it will be over for some of you, most of you who get the tapes of World Watchers later, but for those who listen currently, on Wednesday night, Edwin Wilson is going to have an interview with Larry King, and I'm sure you will have read about it in the press or have seen it by now. Prisoner 08237054 is speaking out of Marion, Illinois, and he's talking about his partners that are involved in the Iran-Contra affair. General Secord, a high official in the United States Air Force, a major general, and Thomas Clines, the CIA official, Theodore Shackley. They were all partners in that company called EATSCO, Egyptian American Transport and Service Company, and they were all given a slap on the wrist by the Justice Department, and there's a brief description of the company in Time magazine June 15th, and Edwin Wilson says that Secord and Shackley and Eric von Marbod, a former Defense Department official, were all partners. Now, von Marbod was tapped by Frank Carlucci to work with him with the Sears company that made arms and weapons after Frank Carlucci left the Defense Department. Before he became National Security Advisor, he had an interim where he plucked Eric von Marbod out from the middle of this team, and Carlucci is the watchdog at the White House. He's their Doberman, looking to see who touches his partners, because he worked with Clines and Secord and Edwin Wilson and so forth. This is the group that Ollie North tapped. And Wilson said, if I'm guilty of taking money and of funding the terrorists of Libya, they're arming Iran. And he said, if I got 52 years, Ollie North ought to get 300. And Edwin Wilson, an interview for Time, and he will be on the air. There's another article about him last January as the arrests were moving along, not the arrests, the investigations of people. There's been no arrest yet. But Edwin Wilson told about his working with these people. And again, this came out of the Stanford Technology Group, and how they took $8 million out of a $71 million contract of shipping arms to Egypt. And at the time in 1979, I said that part of those weapons were going to the PLO instead of to Egypt. And Wilson identified his partners, and Eric von Marbod last January, the business partner of our current National Security Advisor, and right away he was talking about those things. I'm sure he will have more on the air, or you will have heard more. Now, we have an organization in California, I don't know if there's national chapters or not, it's called the World Affairs Council, and they're very conservative people. It's formed by members of the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco and the Bohemian Grove up in Santa Rosa, and a member of the World Affairs Council was in Monterey, Carmel, having their monthly meeting, a luncheon, and I want to read to you what he had to say. It was in the Monterey Herald, and it's very important that I don't leave a word out of the article that they reprinted in the paper today. Now, this same World Affairs Council is the one who was going to have Mr. Duarte from El Salvador, and there were going to be thousands of people down here to demonstrate, so the visit was called off. This is what Leslie Lipson told them at the luncheon on Saturday. The title is Invisible Government Upsets the Balance of Powers. And again, this is Leslie Lipson from the University of California, a professor who taught there and a member of the board, a trustee of the World Affairs Council of Northern California. See if this sounds like Mae Brussell. This is what he said. The balance of power among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of the U.S. government has been upset by the emergence of an invisible government, and it is now tipped in favor of the presidency, according to a scholar of political affairs who spoke Saturday in Carmel Valley. Leslie Lipson, professor emeritus of University of California and trustee of the World Affairs Council of Northern California, spoke, and his topic was the Constitution and the conduct of our foreign policy. He said the United States is celebrating the bicentennial of its Constitution at a time of constitutional crisis due to the abuses of executive power in the conduct or misconduct of foreign policy. The history of republics and democracies from Athens and Rome through Great Britain and France has shown that such governments do not do well in resolving the contradiction between the practice of democracy at home and the control of empires abroad. Americans are confronting the same problem as they exercise power in imperial dimensions. He said it is straining the Constitution to the breaking point. The adversary relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union has developed since 1945 and has created the arms race and a massive espionage effort. I might add that the real crack in the Constitution, or the power of the president getting the most power, it did come after World War II with the National Security Council. But the illegal rearming of Germany when the Soviet Union came into being and was seemed like it was going to be staying there by 1919, with the help of Herbert Hoover and Congress and the multinational bankers and corporations, the illegal rearming of Germany, putting Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco, was the first problem, and not being able to get rid of them and bringing their agents here became the second problem. Back to what he's saying, though. The result has been, he's saying, since World War II, has been the growth of a new level of government, an invisible government in the form of the intelligence agencies. Whatever their initials, whether CIA, DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, NSA, National Security Administration, or NSC, National Security Council, these shadow governments share the characteristics of secrecy and lack of accountability. And up until now, all the emphasis I'm inserting here has been on the CIA, and he is saying the DIA, the NSA, and the NSC, and those are really the places to look. He said their products, covert operations, and prevalence of lies have resulted in the destruction of trust in government and the potential for authoritarian regime operating through fear. They are accountable to no man or woman, I insert, the President of the United States. They are accountable to one man, rather, and I think they're to no one but themselves, but they're accountable to one man, the President of the United States, and have grown under the authority of current and past presidents of both parties who have used and abused their powers and facilities to produce 3 national scandals in 20 years. These include Lyndon Johnson's undeclared war in Vietnam, Richard Nixon's secret bombing war in Cambodia, the overthrow of the President Salvador Allende of Chile, and the current arms race to Iran and secret Contra war in Central America under President Reagan. And when he says, since Lyndon Johnson, note that he left out the era of John Kennedy, he mentions him later, but the real problems began when the government changed hands as soon as Lyndon Johnson took that oath of office in Dallas. To complete what he said, this accumulation of power has twisted and distorted the Constitution and dealt a body blow to the democratic process. We cannot automatically believe the statements of heads of government. There has been an excessive, irresponsible growth in presidential power. The checks and balances exist only in secret bank accounts. If presidential power has grown, presidential effectiveness has not. President Kennedy and his successors have all been failures, and there is something wrong with the system in which we have 6 failed presidents in sequence. Now, Kennedy only served 1,000 days and had his head blown off, so it's hard to know what the failure was that he had in mind, although he did set up Operation Mongoose and the plans to overthrow Fidel Castro, but he pulled back from the invasion of Cuba, and that was something that this team would never approve of and didn't approve of, and blew his head off because of it. In conclusion, he said the concentration of power has made the presidency too burdensome for any one person to wield its power effectively. Quoting a resolution of Parliament to King George III, Lipson said, the powers of the Crown have increased, are increasing, and ought to be diminished. And he's hit on a lot of the problems, that they can't be trusted, they're not accountable. except to the president, that their authority exceeds both parties, that they've abused the parties, they've been involved in scandals for 20 years, and societies do break down when we practice things at foreign shores that we don't practice at home. Those societies break apart, and that they're secret societies, and they have maintained themselves through their invisible, no accountability, and the agencies are identified, the shadow organizations, and the secrecy and lack of accountability. He stresses several times the covert operations. Now, this is a person, a trustee of the World Affairs Council, the Northern Chapter of the World Affairs Council, and this is not any liberal group. These aren't people in Berkeley who should be addressing themselves to the question. This is a group of very, very staunch conservatives who are being told by one of their board of directors the situation exactly as it is. Now, David Emery, I mentioned before, and NIPTUC have a program up in the Bay Area, and they've made a series called the Archive Tapes, so that you can get tape cassettes that cover a lot of what I tried to explain in this past article, exemplifies the problems in this country. We have worked on this. I've worked on it for 23 years. I've been on the air 16 years now. And David and Nip have had a series of broadcasts. I'll give you the address, and you can send 4 titles. They have a 3-hour series, 3 to 4 hours, on the very factors that make up that secret team and how they operate. And the fact is they're not so secret if you want to hear and study them. There's sections on the Aryan nations, on the Kennedy assassination, the World Anti-Communist League, on AIDS, on who shot the Pope, the terror connection, the CIA and military and narcotics. You can send for these. Send a self-addressed stamped envelope to DAVKORE, DAVKORE, 1300D, Space Parkway, Mountain View, 94043. Dave has done a monumental job of making a series of 28, and then he's got 4 more, and then he's got more others that cover this whole era, the period from 1945, when the war was over, until the present. And while I cover a lot of subjects each week of World Watchers, and sometimes specifically one subject for the entire hour, if you want to sit back and understand how these things came down again, you can get these series and add to your library of tape collections. The book Inside the League came out just about a year ago, almost a year ago, but currently enough, there is a review of it in the San Francisco Chronicle. It happened last Sunday, titled The Dark Side of Patriotism. And this is a picture of John Singlaub, a member of the World Anti-Communist League, as is Jesse Helms, and Mr. McClure, a member of the House Senate and Contra Investigations. If you wonder why he isn't asking questions and he's giving a political stance. But the review is very timely, and they decided where it was suppressed before to bring it out. And it gives you a little insight, if you read Inside the League, about who these secret people are who are manipulating the government. And the review says that it tells a repulsive but riveting story of international Freemasonry of the ultra-right, fascists, Nazis, and racists who make up the World Anti-Communist League. And of course, Singlaub is on the board of Western Goals, and he's the main fundraiser for the Contras. It said, lest we forget, Adolf Hitler did exactly the same thing as these activists are doing, justifying their crusade against godless communism. And the review compares the activities of the World Anti-Communist League to the activities that happened with Adolf Hitler. And WACL has 90 branches in 6 continents, and it's a very good review of the depth and breadth of American congressmen and senators and Catholic archbishops and British members of Parliament in the World Anti-Communist League. So the review is very timely. A picture of John Singlaub, The Dark Side of Patriotism, comparing it to Hitler, and it fits in with what members of the World Affairs Council are being shown is a secret team inside our government that will destroy our democracy, and it will destroy any government other than fascism if it isn't stopped. I'll take 1 minute break and then go on to some of the Iran-Contra material, but I did want to update these other matters with you. This is Mae Brussell. It is the second half of World Watchers, program number 810. The Wall Street Journal had a long article on the TWH hijacking and another article apropos of the terrorism of hijacking and bombing airports titled, Current 9-Month Lull in Hijackings Isn't Expected to Continue Indefinitely. And I thought it was interesting that the article refers to the Karachi airport hijacking the Pan Am, and that was just the night before Ronald Reagan came off of his mountain to start campaigning for Ed Chow, and the Vienna and Rome airports that were used for Reagan's excuses for bombing Libya. And it goes into the synagogue that was where they had the shootout, that terrorism in Turkey, which was never solved. The members of the synagogue, the survivors, went back to start praying last week. The Turkish government said that would never be solved. And I thought, 9 months is from October, when Eugene Hasenfuss landed on that piece of grass in Nicaragua, and the White House and Oliver North and their network have been on the defensive ever since. And I suspect, and because of a lot of articles and material I've been putting together, that they were behind the KAL accident when their good friend Larry McDonald was blown away, and they could blame the Soviet Union, the Antichrist, the beast, for that air disaster. And I believe they've been behind the Achille Laura, and I'll give you more evidence on those reasons in a little while, maybe in a few weeks, and the TWA hijackings and the Berlin disco, and all these various incidences that gave Ronald Reagan the muscle for his inner team, his Secord, Clines, Shackley, Singlaub group with Oliver North, to get their violent anti-communist stance. They were on the anti-terrorist committees with Michael Ledeen and so forth. And I think that since October, which is exactly 9 months, they've been so busy, because right after the Hasenfuss landing, the newspaper in Lebanon broke the story about the arms going to the Shah, that this team hasn't been able to do their actions. They sneaked the one on Grenada without the American press being there. And as I say, I believe that they have been a Reichstag operation to create terrorism, and they have the links inside and outside the government and in these countries to do these things, and then create their own heroism, their own medals, and create the reason for their existence or the funding to put down these terrible terrorists. So there was a note, as I say, in the Wall Street Journal, that it's 9 months since these things happened. It'd be interesting to see how much terrorism there would be if this whole gang would go to jail and stayed there for 20 years, like Franklin Camper. He's there now, but Oliver North and the Secord, Hakim, Shackley, Cline, Singlaub group, defendants in the Christic Institute suit, but it's a long way from filing a suit to seeing those guys in the clink. Now, a lot has been made about Fawn Hall, and her testimony was absolutely frightening, hearing her speak, and her arrogance and her anger. And there were always controversies before she testified. Were the papers in her bra? Were they in her pants, in her boots? It didn't matter where. If some congressman said they were put in her pants, she'd say they were in the back of her bra. Where they were located doesn't matter at all. The thing that matters is what was on the papers, and what did she see, and did she, of course she didn't read it, she would have an out, but what was on the papers, and what did Ollie North decide to burn? And when he saved some papers and handed them, she handed them to him in a car, took them out of the office. That's the important matter, is where did they put those papers afterwards? And unless I missed something, I didn't hear that question. They did ask her when she was on the stand, do you recall whether there were any memos to the president among the documents that you were asked to shred? This is her answer. I don't recall, sir. She always had the sir. I did not shred individual packages. I shredded 12, 15, 18 pages at once. I don't think the question was, did you shred packages that would have the president's name on them? They asked her, were there any memos to the president? And her answer had nothing to do with that question. But her having those papers was very important, and her having them, whatever was left behind that she called Ollie about, it was important that she shared it with him, handed it over to him, and then he was with Mr. Green, the attorney. So Fawn also testified they had one document about Gomez-Rodriguez, Max Gomez, Felix Rodriguez, the same person, with two names. and they said, let's put this one back, they'll have fun with this. Well, she testified on June the 8th about they will have fun with this. But on June the 8th, and I mentioned this last week on my program, Jack Anderson printed an article that George Bush was in trouble because of his relationship with Max Gomez-Rodriguez. Now, Jack Anderson worked very closely with Frank Sturgis for over 20 years, and their relationship came out at the time of the Watergate investigations. Frank Sturgis has a double name like Gomez-Rodriguez, and he's Frank Fiorini, and he also is named as a person put on a hit team by Santos Traficanta that Robert Mayu would hire, and this association is linked to the Christic Institute affidavit, and Frank Sturgis and Jack Anderson are very close. Frank Sturgis saw Jack Anderson at the airport the day that they flew in from Miami, and they were going to enter the Watergate Hotel that night, all purely coincidental, you understand. But the timing here was interesting, that the day that she's testifying that they'll have fun with this one is the day that he's putting out the material about George Bush that they're having the fun with. Now, the timing of the documents became a question. They asked her, what time did Ollie North pick you up? And the time of day was important. She identified it around dusk towards the end of the day. Ollie was at the hotel with an attorney by the name of Mr. Green, and Mr. Green was became an attorney for the moment for Hakim, Secord, and North, and then later he was representing General Secord when he was the first person to testify. Now, at that time that they were all at the hotel together, the president vice president had called over to the hotel to speak to Ollie North, and to Mr. Green wouldn't reveal what was said, or Secord wouldn't because Green was in the room, but the president and vice president called that day. And after that call, those two men went and met Fawn Hall, and she had something in her blouse and shirt, and in her boot, rather, and gave it to the men, and they questioned, should we do it now? And Mr. Green suggested, there was a conversation of when to transfer the papers and so forth. Now, this past week, or week and a half, there's been an article, or a series of articles in the newspaper about, I mentioned money last week, the Greens. There's been a list of gifts given to members of Congress, and among the congressmen was Howard Baker, who got approximately over $200,000 when he was in the Senate from Merrill Lynch. Now, that's interesting phenomena because Mr. Don Reagan was the chairman of Merrill Lynch before he worked for the Reagan administration, secretary-treasurer, and then watching the watchdog of the president while all this was going on, very much a part of it, as the chief of staff. And the man to succeed the chief of staff, Donald Reagan, was Howard Baker, who had received $250,000 from Merrill Lynch. No reason specified, but he did get over $200,000 from Merrill Lynch, the company that Donald Reagan is associated with. So when Reagan was in trouble, it's interesting to know that the new NSC director was Frank Carlucci, who brought in, who literally was a business partner the last few years with Eric von Marbod, the partner of Secord, Hakim, Clines, and Edwin Wilson. So the National Security Council had a person functioning next to that inner team that were involved in past skimming of $7 million, and Senator Howard Baker had received over $200,000 from Merrill Lynch, and he succeeds Donald Reagan becoming head of the chief of staff. Now the president and vice president have to list their gifts. Remember, Taiwan gave $2 million to the Contras, but evidently there was no record of the Contras receiving it. The Sultan of Brunei gave $10 million, and that never got to the Contras, although, as I mentioned last week, if it is turned over, he wants the whole amount back. The arrangement had been, if they received it, Mr. Willis Zucker and Lake Resources and the Hakim banking accounts, Hakim was going to keep $7 million for the enterprise and $3 million for the Contras. So there's a lot of millions and many other millions floating around. So when they listed the president's income of gifts, they listed approximately $17,000 of gifts that he and Nancy had received. But there isn't anything on that list of 1986 that talks about a home that was bought for Ronald Reagan and Mrs. Reagan at 666, interesting number for those of you who like that kind of inference and numerology and so forth. 666 St. Cloud Road, Bel Air, California, purchased for the Reagans. The home cost approximately $2 million. Now, Ollie got $15,000 for house security, $200,000 for family education was offered, a $2 million insurance policy made out to him. What did Reagan get? And the point is, who can Reagan protect, and why does he bring in Carlucci, who worked with von Marbod, and how much of a prisoner is this man, whose days as president are literally over, and why don't they list the property that Ronald Reagan has as a gift? How do we know it didn't come out of the Iran-Contra money as one of the team players? He loves Ollie North. They all love each other. They can't buy the weapons from the NSC, from Singlaub at half price. They have to give it to Secord, Hakim, Cline, Shackley, and that gang. And what is the obligation there? Now, in the book California Incorporated, I had mentioned this book on broadcast 689 quite a while back because I was referring at that time to Stanley Plogg's Behavior Science Corporation that was assigned the important task of educating Ronald Reagan. He was going to become president. But before he became governor, rather, grooming him for president, but brainwashing him for governor. But during this time period, in this same book, the same page where it tells about sending him to Stanley Plogg's for behavioral science courses, the chapter is called The Grassroots, and it tells about friends of Ronald Reagan in 1965 who were all acquainted in business and politics, and they got together and decided that their corporate interests would be recognized in the care of Ronald Reagan. So they set up a committee. The committee was called the Ronald Reagan Defense, not the Defense Fund, the Ronald Reagan, Friends of Ronald Reagan. And this was a group in California, in Los Angeles. And then the chairman of the group, the Friends of Ronald Reagan, was described in this book a well-connected Pasadena attorney named Robert Mardian, who later would serve as U.S. Attorney General under Richard Nixon and play a role in the Watergate scandal. Now, Robert Mardian's attorney at the time of Watergate for a lot of this material was, a lot of these incidences happening, was Mr. Green, the same Mr. Green that was with Ollie North and Fawn Hall when she left the National Security offices in the old executive office building and carried these papers out with her. The same Green who is allegedly representing immediately Hakim and Secord and the very inner team of North and so forth. Green is the first attorney representing Secord on the stand, and he has links going back to Robert Mardian and the Friends of Ronald Reagan. As soon as Reagan became governor in 1966 and Richard Nixon came in power in 1968, Mardian, Ronald Reagan's chairman for Friends of Ronald Reagan, became the Assistant Attorney General under John Mitchell, and that's when they began the COINTEL program, the MK Ultra, the Army photographing people, opening mail, sending letters, breaking up institutions, and so forth. Mardian was very instrumental in all of that, and also through the years when Ronald Reagan was setting up the SLA, which was done with the Defense Department and the CIA. There was an article in the LA Times this morning. Congressman says impeachment possible if Reagan knew of funds. And I'm going to share, most of you probably saw this today, but I want to share one item on this. It says the April 1986 memorandum that was drafted for Reagan by Oliver North clearly outlined the diversion of money to the Contras. And they haven't been able to find it yet. If the memo had reached the hands of the president and he had approved it, that would be the smoking gun. Now, would she take that out? If she put it in her boots and gave it to Ollie as the assurance that they get a full pardon or don't go to jail or do get that $2 million in the fund that was set up by Albert Hakim for Ollie North, this team are a tight group of the real warfare state that Fred Cook writes about, and you can see it on their faces, and they're looking for this October 66 memorandum. And last November 22nd, the anniversary of Kennedy's death, the day after North and his secretary destroyed hundreds of documents, there was a search for the April 86. Well, after they purposely destroyed all that, how far do you have to look for the document? Now, the memo, and this is what the detail of the memo was, It proposed to sell 3.7 million in United States anti-aircraft missile parts to Iran for 17 million. They would make a nice profit. Of the profits, the memo said 12 million will be used to purchase critically needed supplies for the Nicaraguan Democratic Resistance Forces. The memo said this is what would happen. Now, I'm not aware that the memo said 6 to 7 million would be given to Albert Hakim for their enterprise. It doesn't say that at all. He is telling us on television that it is his money, I'm a businessman. There is nothing in that document of April 1986 that agrees that he and Secord, Hakim, Shackley, and Clines are all going to get a piece of that huge 6 to 7 million. He testified it was his, but where does it say that was his when it said the money would go to the Contras? Now, there have been articles in the Wall Street Journal on this matter. Revised NSC memo on diversion of funds from arms sales was found in a computer file. This is June the 10th. There was a later draft of a controversial 86 memo outlining the plans to divert the proceeds of arms sales to Iran to aid Nicaragua, but a paper copy of that draft has yet to be found. Well, that's why they were shredding. They can look night and day, but that is why they were shredding. The San Francisco Chronicle had an article about Fawn Hall. They said Hall's testimony belies her image. For anyone who listened as well as watched, she came across not as a glamour figure at all, but as a disturbing mixture of admirable traits and scary omissions. And it says, distracted by Hall's immediate appeal as a mediagenic phenomena, a word they use for irresistible to the media, we overlooked the more dismal truth. In her own small way, Hall seemed to be what used to be termed, admittedly, in a different context, a good German. She was just purely doing her job. And it was Sir this and Sir that, and she is still in the military at the present time. So, and Oliver North has said, this is June the 5th, 1987, North reportedly altered memo on telling Ronald Reagan. They altered documents on telling Ronald Reagan that he was going to be briefed on the financial diversion of arms to the Contra. And they're playing around with Ronald Reagan, what he knows and doesn't know. Well, they're also saying, I put these in my blouse and I put them in my boots. And she took those, Tom Green, that attorney, she offered, do you want them now, when they were out of the old executive office building? And Green said, no, wait until we get inside the car, in Tom Green's car. And she said, I started pulling the documents from my boots and pulled them from my back and indicated to North, I believe at this time I have completed the process of replacing all the documents in the files. Now, did she do that, or were they pulling out the documents on Ronald Reagan to assure that they wouldn't be the fall guys? Because when they asked her, were there memos to the president, she didn't answer that. As I cited before, she didn't answer that at all. Now, to show you how the system operates, and this is really how the system operates, Richard Secord, the gentleman who's co-partner of Stanford Technology, the Stanford Technology Trading Group, the man involved in all these operations, spoke last weekend as a guest, would you believe it, at the State Bar of Texas. They had their convention, and he spoke at the State Bar. He was invited. I remember Leon Jaworski of the Warren Commission, of the Senate hearings, of the Korea Gate hearings, who covered all these messes up that are festering now. He used to be president of the American Bar Association. This past weekend, Secord was on the news. He told the State Bar of Texas that the United States has been seriously damaged, that they should have told the president should have told the Congress, and he blamed increasing congressional involvement in what is previously was the exclusive domain of the executive branch for a breakdown in U.S. foreign policy. National security has suffered greatly in the past 15 or 20 years with an enormous statutory outlay involved. It's difficult to function, he says. Now we are nearly near gridlock, and it seems to me it's one of the reasons why the White House turned to private sources in the past years to do things they thought were of vital importance and could not be done within the system. He's telling the Bar Association. So the White House group, think that they can do things that bypass the Congress, the checks and balances, and the words of these people like Fawn or Secord, and considering where he's speaking at the Texas Bar Association, are very dangerous. He says the president's hands are tied by legislation such as War Powers Act, which requires the president to notify Congress, and also by the Arms Export Control Act, which limits presidents' ability to transfer weapons and technology to other countries. Now, we see on the anniversary of Vietnam Memorial Day people weeping and feeling their names on stone, cut in stone, for these terrible wars. And who wants Singlaub and Shackley and North deciding what wars and who goes to war? Or Henry Kissinger and the National Security Council, or Fritz Kramer, Alexander Haig. They want complete control, and none of those people were elected for any office that I know of. And they think that you have to go beyond the government, the checks and balances, which is what was expressed at that World Affairs Council meeting. You go beyond it because our hands are tied, and they won't let us do what we want. There was an article in San Jose Mercury, I don't know if it went over your wire services, about Thomas C. Green. It says lawyers scrutinized for a role in Iran affair. The Washington lawyer, and this was the lawyer for Mardian, one of the team of lawyers during the Watergate time. Thomas Green, his name has popped up so often that Senator Warren Rudman raises the question of whether he was a lawyer or a participant. The subject of Green's conduct came up during questioning of Fawn Hall. Green spent 4 days at the hearing next to Richard V. Secord. At different times, testimony indicated he represented Secord's partner, Albert Hakim, and also Oliver North of the National Security Council. It was Green who met with Secord, North, and Hakim November 24th, as Attorney Meese was learning about the secret Contra matters. Green received at least a $40,000 finder's fee after linking Secord up with an arms supplier so the weapons could be sold to the Contras at a time the U.S. government was barred from sending arms. That's the attorney who worked for Mardian, who was part of putting Ronald Reagan in as governor. Green refused to testify in April before a federal grand jury investigating the Iran-Contra case, according to his attorney Earl Silbert, who's of famous Watergate investigations. You can look up Silbert's name, and he's closely linked to Nixon and John Mitchell and the Watergate team. In the appearance before the grand jury of independent counsel Lawrence Walsh, Green cited reasons for not testifying, including attorney-client and other privileges and Fifth Amendment right. When North held a shredding party to destroy key documents in the office, November 21st, it was Green's name that appeared on North's calendar for a meeting that followed the incident. When Hall left her boss's office November 25th with secret documents in her clothes and in her boots, it was Green who accompanied her and North out of the building. According to Hall, Green did not tell her to take the documents back after he learned she had them. And when Fawn Hall said she would give a misleading answer if asked about the shredding, Green, according to Hall, said, "Good. The record will be reviewed again by the independent counsel to see his connection in sending weapons that were illegal and representing allegedly the three being with the people that destroyed the documents, and he also supplied the source of arms for some of the sales." So this team are strong, they're active, and they do not intend to give up their money back to the government or even to the Contras, but to keep it so their enterprise keeps going. This past weekend, you might have read that General Secord was a guest speaker at the State Bar of Texas. Instead of being in prison, he's speaking to the Bar of Texas, and he explained to them that he blamed congressional involvement in interfering with the policies of the exclusive domain of the President of the United States, the executive branch, and that it causes a breakdown in foreign policy. And he said, "We're near a gridlock to me. It's one of the reasons why the White House turned to private sources the last couple of years to try to do things they thought were of vital importance that could not be done within the system." He means we will do what the system doesn't allow us to do. And he says the president's hands are tied by War Powers Act. In the meanwhile, you hear the testimony of Hakim that they are guaranteeing a war against the Soviet Union with Iran, or helping Iran to invade Iraq and take over Iraq, and Congress isn't supposed to know about those things. The Washington Post had a story March the 1st. There were a lot of them. North memo said $12 million in residual funds would aid the rebels. We know now that it didn't go to the rebels, the Contras, that the hunks of millions, 7 or 8, and many, many more are sitting in accounts for a much larger enterprise. San Jose Mercury had a story March the 8th. Secord-led secret counterterrorism unit, retired Air Force officer bypassed the official controls. Well, that's exactly what is happening. That is what this man was saying when he spoke to the World Affairs Council this week. And he put it very, very nicely, a summary of, as I say, of what I've been doing. And the articles just come up front and say they bypassed it. Secord was interviewed May 17th in the San Francisco Examiner. He said, "Keep my bank account secret." He is speaking at the bar in Texas, telling them that Congress interferes with the War Powers Act, that it interferes with the decisions of the executive office, but don't touch my money and don't get to the Credit Suisse documents. And he mentioned specifically Credit Suisse in Geneva, and that you should not get tangled in the Iranian, Swiss, and Saudi monies in Credit Suisse. And then another time he was interviewed May 29th, and he said Iran-Contra hearings are a circus. What good came of Watergate? What good can come of the Iran-Contra hearings? And he said they project a cartoon version of democracy around the world. Now, the Wall Street Journal is not a very leftist newspaper. I cite them from time to time, and they have some wonderful articles. And to show you the danger of Secord and this team, I want to cite an article, June the 11th, 1987. It's on page 50 of the Wall Street Journal. And this is titled, "Politics and Policy. North, fascinated with war in Angola, hoped the network would go beyond the Iran-Contra effort." And it tells about his wanting to set up systems to overthrow Angola, to get rid of the regime that's in Angola, and that they would stretch their corporate efforts. This enterprise from Switzerland to Panama to Liberia, and the Wall Street Journal said they set up what amounted to a private intelligence agency that has astounded and astonished lawmakers with its intricacy and exploits. North and his partners offered not only tons of weapons to the Contras, gave them, they harvested millions of dollars of profit, more than $8 million, and many more, not counting millions of dollars in assets and strings of companies, such as the one that makes machine guns that fires 177 rounds in 6 seconds. It was a junta within the executive branch. That's a quotation of Senator Paul Sarbanes. Michael Armacost, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, said, "I thought it was appalling. I thought I heard everything. It keeps getting worse. The idea that you negotiate with another country through CIA people who are retired, a retired general, and an Iranian businessman who was only recently naturalized is shocking." The article quotes Secord defending the system. He says the network that we have responds more quickly and creatively than the CIA and the Pentagon. The system, our judicial and executive, legislative, constitutional system, has to be unlocked, and I'm not holding my breath until we get a president who's strong enough to do that, said General Secord. And then the Wall Street Journal goes on and compares these men to the Algerian colonels, and that's why the story of Algiers and France and the plot to kill de Gaulle is so important. He said they're like the Algerian colonels, a group of French military officers who in 1958 tried to overthrow the French government because they feared its policies would lead to the loss of France's most important North Algerian colony. These people were dangerous, said an intelligence official in the United States. And the book Farewell America tells about the group, the French colonels that tried to kill Charles de Gaulle and then went on and killed John Kennedy, and the French colonels work with our American government. There are all kinds of links and ties. The Great Heron Coup by Kruger cites many references, and the history books are filled with our CIA intelligence and the French colonels. The comparison is appropriate because they're the same group of people. The article goes on how North was going to set up a ship outside of Libya to give disinformation to the Libyan army, and the Wall Street Journal concludes the private network was still expanding when one of their planes was shot down last October in Nicaragua. That's the one with Hassanfuss. According to General Secord, the Iranians that same month agreed to deposit $40 million in a Frankfurt branch of Credit Suisse, set up permanent European office to manage secret U.S. arms sales to Iran that would involve Israel, Iran, and the Secord Hakim team. My time is up, and I've got to I don't even have time to finish the last few minutes of this article. It's very important. Maybe I'll read it a little slower, and again, one more time next week when World Watchers continues. But meantime, the time is up, and this is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you with more news on the Iran-Contra scandal and other developments related to these people. I'll be back with you next week.